Well, we got to basically just tell the truth to everybody so that they wake up and look at what's going on out there, because I've never seen the mainstream media lie so much.
The dramatic impact of the Trump approach to trade with the tariff threat. Let me just start with some simple questions. Is it going to be effective?
No, I mean, look, 25% tariff is more of a political ploy for negotiation. What he did to China, 10%, that's more of an economic tariff.
Is there any history of governments being able to control? And it's more complicated than ever, as you were alluding to much earlier, but more complicated than ever, more variables than ever. Has anybody ever succeeded? Because they keep trying to sell that to the public.
No, it's never worked even once.
Yeah.
So the Fed didn't raise rates today. Why? Because now the Fed has realized if they raise rates, it doesn't stop inflation. Why? Because then the government expenditures go up anyhow. So the central banks have been neutered, basically. All the theories that they had from the Great Depression, none of them work anymore. But they can't say this publicly because it's a confidence game.
I keep getting feedback, and I feel this personally myself. There's so many things going on, it's hard to keep track of them. And some of them with contrary impact on whether we're talking the stock market, gold, currencies, overall economic growth, etc. And when that happens, I always find it a huge privilege and benefit to be able to talk with Martin Armstrong. He's the originator of the Socrates model, and I mean over 40 years ago when people hadn't heard the word artificial intelligence. But it's a model that in the past has predicted things specifically like the fall of the Berlin Wall to the date, and so many other things. But I remember that was being in the early 80s, and I sort of went, wow, what's that guy up to? But so many other things, a record of accuracy that comes out of his model. And I'll just reiterate that Marty always says, hey, this is the work of my model. No individual could process this many variables that we're feeding in. Well, obviously, it's been beneficial to his subscribers of Socrates and ArmstrongEconomics.com. We've benefited over the years having a chance to chat. That's why I'm excited to chat with Marty today. Marty, thanks for taking the time.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Mike. It's always a pleasure.
As I said, so many things hitting us. So I'm going to start with, I think, at least from Canadians and I bet Mexicans and other points of view, the dramatic impact of the Trump approach to trade with the tariff threat. Let me just start with some simple questions. Is it going to be effective?
No, I mean, look, 25% tariff is more of a political ploy for negotiation. What he did to China, 10%, that's more of an economic tariff. And that's the main thing. You're not going to fund the government with tariffs. You're just not going to do it. But Trump is, I think, acting based upon the old theories that we were taught in school back when. They don't work.
Mm-hmm.
But every government still uses them, central banks. But no, I don't see that as working. The idea that the U.S. used to be funded by tariffs during the 19th century, historically correct, but it was also before socialism. So we didn't have all these socialistic, programs, Social Security, all this sort of stuff. So things have changed.
What I worry about is that, the impact not just on, for example, the Canadian economy, which would be obviously negative, and our retaliatory tariffs. People are learning that when someone puts on a tariff, they pay for it in that domestic economy. But I look at it weakening the U.S. economy and the Canadian and the Mexican and wherever those tariffs are knocked on. But the impact of that could be really profound on a global basis.
Well, I do find it curious that I had testified before Congress back in '96 on all these issues. And I had said back then the corporate tax rate has to be lowered to 15% to match Hong Kong. And also that the reason all this manufacturer left the country wasn't because they're paying, $2 less to this guy to work than somebody else. I mean, that's all Marxist propaganda. It's the fact that the U.S. charges worldwide taxation on income. So you just eliminate that and they'll all come back. It has nothing to do with tariffs or anything else. I mean, that's how I got to meet Margaret Thatcher. She was asked me why I was putting all the like auto manufacturers in Britain. And I said, because all the regulations on labor in Germany was 40% higher than that in Britain. So it's not something that, I'm paying this guy $10 and getting it for $5 over here. That's not the issue. That's usually very minimal. It's all the regulations and taxation.
Well, we're looking at a time now where the U.S. is promising to lower taxation, lower regulation, as you've just alluded to. I think in Canada, we should be very worried about that. The tariffs would be bad. Retaliation makes them worse. But my goodness, we're going to be dramatically uncompetitive with our next door neighbor when it comes to regulation and taxation at the corporate level.
Well, a number of Canadian clients have told me that they ought to send a thank you note to Trump because he exposed the fact that your provinces all have tariffs on each other back and forth. And like a lawyer in Nova Scotia can't practice in Newfoundland. And I mean, these are all throwbacks to, the old Marxist days. And a lot of people didn't realize of all the internal tariffs that Canada had, which are, would be illegal in the United States.
Interesting. Well, it's interesting because, the estimates are out there, and I agree that we should thank President Trump on this one because we're talking about estimates as high as $200 billion annual cost to the overall, Canadian economy. And it's never been popular. I mean, they have tried for decades to remove these, but of course, special interest groups jump right in and nothing's really happened. And I'll say on this one, I'm glad they're talking about it. We'll see if something meaningful happens. But yes, I thought President Trump, I patted him on the back. In 2 months, he got more done on that front than Canadian politicians had in decades.
Yeah, well, a lot of Canadians weren't even aware that there were such tariffs. Because the press doesn't really highlight it or things of that nature. So, but I mean, this is part of the problem where you still have this idea of parliamentary governments in Europe and Canada. So you have people that are making decisions that are not actually elected. Like in Europe, Ursula, she's just appointed. And then all the people that make the decisions on laws in Europe don't stand for election. So the problem that I get from Europe is that they're like, what the hell is going on here? They have no right to actually vote to get rid of these people. So what do you do?
Well, let me add this, though, Marty. There's sort of a growing talk about Canada wanting to become the part of the EU. And I just roll my eyes saying, are you kidding? You love bureaucracy that much? You want an energy crisis? You want a sovereign debt crisis to escalate? Oh, and of course you want war with Russia. I'm just flabbergasted with they're saying something like half of Canadians would support that. And I'm going, Lord, what have they done?
Well, it's largely because they don't understand anything about the truth. Hungary voted against giving aid to Ukraine. So what did they do? Okay, well, we'll just remove Hungary's right to vote. Italy just came out and said, what are you doing? We're not going to, retaliation against the United States is not the way to go. And she even came out, we're not sending troops to Ukraine. The problem is when you create a centralized government, it becomes dictatorial. And we're even seeing the same thing here in Florida, where the centralized state government trying to take power away from municipalities. It's always the same thing, no matter what country you look at. I don't know. They just get bored, and maybe I could do something if I had more power. you know.
Yeah.
But joining the EU is fragmenting right now, and you just had a very large surge in basically what they call the far right, which is anti-central government, and I mean the AfD in Germany, which was a laughing stock before, came in number 2. It and people I talk to there, I have friends there, they won't even allow their 13-year-old daughter to walk to the 2 blocks to the bus station anymore. They drive them. The migrant crisis there is much worse than it is in North America.
I would go further, when I look at the EU and this desire to join them, it's devoid of economic sophistication, completely. But I want to go further with that, because one of the things you've been chronicling is the amount of money that's leaving the EU, amount of physical gold that's leaving the EU as sort of a marker for what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, they are pushing very, very rapidly to cancel the currency and move to a digital. The reason why is it's capital controls. Once they do that, you can't get any money out. All right, all you got to do is look at World War I. What did they do? They shut down all the stock markets. When you go into war, they put on capital controls, and the EU is moving that way very rapidly already. They've even put out hints that they may take up to 10 trillion in private savings to use to fund the war. Hand you bonds, Germany did that too in 1922, and they defaulted on, and that caused the hyperinflation. So it always seems to be the same story over and over and over again.
Are you finding an overlap when you look at the Socrates model between, a broad, I not even mean a broad timing, a pretty close timing between, if there's escalating war, does that coincide with what you're seeing for the US dollar in the same model? Because the model always looks separately at each one of these, and then you look and say, oh, look, that's very similar. And I'm thinking a piece of advice that you have given, which is, you know what, the risk of government bonds isn't worth it. But they're related to the war because of, we've already got many examples when governments do whatever they want. I still love the guy in Greece who coined that phrase, we're not going to pay our debt. This is going back, just under 20 or just over 20 years, but I'm not going to pay our debt. We'll just extend it. So you thought you were getting your money back, in 3 years. How about 23 years? So we've seen when these events come up, and also we saw it during the pandemic, all sorts of rules got changed. So I'm just wondering, with the model, been accurate about the escalating tensions in Europe, man, does that coincide with what the same model is saying, but separate analysis of bonds and of interest rates and of US dollar, for example?
Yeah, it's the computer actually correlates it all. So it's not really just looking at anything individually. And what you have to understand is what happens is that we're going to war because of the debt crisis. All right. Yeah. So it's like a domino effect. All right. So we wouldn't have war if the European economy was, fat and happy. So you only go to war when you're struggling, really. When everybody's making money and nobody cares. All right. So Europe, as you know, I was called in when they were forming it. And I told them back then that, you want to compete with the dollar, you have to consolidate the debts like the U.S. did. All right. Hamilton took all the state debts, etc., and that made the federal debt. And it was Helmut Kohl that said no, because he didn't allow the German people to vote. All right, so he set the tone that no consolidation of the debt. And that was 1998 when I was called in. I said, this is going to fail. All right. And I was told then, we just have to get the euro through. We'll worry about the debts later. Here we are in 2025. They still haven't done anything. So as a trader, all they did was they moved volatility from the foreign exchange to the bond markets. And that's what's fragmenting Europe. Because all the promises, oh, we'll all pay the same interest rate, blah, blah, blah. None of that was true. And you're beginning to see the stress signs there in Europe. And you'll see it break apart. You can't keep it this way. And then they want to dictate, migrant policy, Ukraine policy on everybody. We're going to draft all your people, send them off to war with no right to vote. I mean, this is like Vietnam all over again. You were 18. couldn't drink,
Yep.
and you couldn't vote, but you were old enough to go die.
And let me extend that back to what we were saying right at the beginning, and that is the rhetoric from the Trump administration about Canada becoming the 51st state. The tariffs for one thing. I think that's the rhetoric that at least poked the emotions of Canadians.
Yes.
And then the tariffs pile on, of course. But the emotional side of the response came from President Trump saying, "Oh, you're going to be the 51st state," and Prime Minister Trudeau's the governor, and all of this kind of stuff. Give me a quick comment on that. I mean, how impossible is that?
Well, I mean, legally, it's completely impossible. I mean, you can't annex it, anything of that nature. There have been plenty of discussions about joining the United States, over the years. Quebec even had a party called the 51st state. But practically, let's look at it. If Canada wouldn't come in as a state. Assuming it came in, it would break up and each independent province would be a state. All right. Plus your two territories. That means a state gets 2 senators. So therefore you would have 26 senators. All right. In the Senate alone. I mean, it would actually be a reverse takeover. It's not something that I would, say, hey, yeah, go ahead. That's what I mean. These people only look at things from a myopic perspective. Economically, yes, it would make sense to join. Okay. No tariffs, all that stuff. I understand that. However, politically, you have different situations, and I just don't see it that way. I do know a lot of Canadians are getting fed up with your parliamentary system. They feel that, they want a right to vote. Should Carney really be the head of the country? Yes or no? Should we go to war with Ukraine? Yes or no? These are not questions that are even on a ballot. So I understand the frustration.
Yeah, but it's impractical, as you say. It's not even legal, as you say. I've always laughed at it because, this is before the tariff situation and the 51st state comment. About 60% or more of Canadians oppose President Trump. And I'm going, what are you doing? Just importing that opposition? Because it would be much higher today in light of what we've just been alluding to. It's typical, but it reminds me back to the tariffs. And that is, if you think it through, it's an impractical situation to, on the one hand, run on a policy of saying, I want to reduce costs for the blue collar worker, and then put in tariffs, which will increase costs for the blue collar worker, whether it's gasoline from Canada, fruit, vegetables from Mexico, electronics from China. That doesn't make sense either. So maybe and that's exactly, by the way, why I like to come to Socrates. Because it doesn't worry about all of that kind of stuff. I mean, it's already processed it and come up with, dates and numbers, etc.
What will happen is that the trend of, if you really look at the U.S. balance of trade and you allocate it according to the flag the company flies, U.S. has a trade surplus. All right. It's just that a lot of companies moved offshore because of the, global taxation. So what would happen is if he does the major reforms on the income tax, etc., and lowering it to 15% for corporates, they'll come back. All right. So ironically, the tariffs won't do it much really, but what will happen is that it would enable the companies to come back here and make a profit if the foreign competitors can't come in. So it actually would have a reverse tendency. But his idea that bringing back manufacture, et cetera, to the United States would actually work.
Let come back to the Socrates measure of that. What would Socrates say about the next 3 years? Are we entering a global? I'm talking now, global recession.
Yes.
And of course, there's implications for that.
The economy peaked last May, and we're looking at basically a global recession that won't bottom until 2028. The worst of it's going to be in Europe. Europe may be more into a depression than anything else. As I said, the structure of the EU is a disaster. Then you put in the climate change, all right, and that struck down just about everything practical. Then you added COVID, all right, which wiped out a lot of small businesses. And then third, you put sanctions on the energy from Russia. So you doubled or tripled your what's happened is that the French economy actually did shrink by 1% last year. Germany has shrunk 3% minimum, maybe up to 5%. All right. You put so many small businesses out, extinct. All right. So the economies are actually shrinking. And, you have these crazy policies coming from the EU. And one thing a government that I've dealt with, all of them over the years, they will never, ever admit a mistake. So that's why they need the distraction. Carney's basically, beating the 51st state drum up there. Oh, it's Trump. We have to, retaliate, etc. Avoiding any discussion of the economic problems in Canada. In Europe, they're using Russia as a distraction. Oh, if Ukraine falls, all of Europe will go. On one hand, you have NATO saying we can take out, Russia. We don't need the United States. You have Ukraine saying, oh, if we fail, Russia will just come in and take all of Europe. So which is true? I mean, the lies are like, neck deep at this point. And so they use that as a distraction for the fragmentation of the economy in Europe. So if you push the Trump issue aside in Canada and just look at the economics, all the tariffs between everything, and you're in a recession even without the tariffs. So what are you doing? You're just, beating the drums. Oh, it's Trump, Trump, Trump. So you don't have to even discuss the other problems. And, this is what governments do. They always look for a distraction. It can be anything you want. It's always somebody else doing something to them. So it's pretty standard.
Well, I'm thinking of what you just said about Europe too. And again, I'm sorry, I'll just come back for a moment, and half the country wants to join those guys? Like, are you kidding? But our time's running short here. So let me finish with, all of this kind of wraps up a lot of times in getting measured in the currency market. And one of the things that I found fascinating is President Trump's come in and he says, I want a weaker US dollar. He's been declarative on that. And I'm just thinking, how is that going to be possible with the tensions escalating in Europe? Won't capital just continue to flow out of that and back into the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's why a lot of the gold storage is getting out of Europe because they know you go to war, capital controls come. U.S., I've said many times, was bankrupt in 1896. It was World War I and II that brought all the money to North America, even for Canada. Without World War I and II, we probably would still be mostly farmers. So the money's just it's the same thing happening again. The money flows are out of Europe. Most of the private money that institutions that we deal with, they're all getting the hell out. It's just really insane. And these politicians never understand anything. It's always this one issue, this myopic view. We have to do this, and without any consideration for if you do that, what's next. They just don't. They never look at it.
I'm saying this without any kind of political slant. I'm talking about practicality, and that is, do you know of any government? Governments always claim or make pretenses that they can, in quotes, control the economy. I think that's what Trump is doing to some extent in the States right now. I'll put the tariffs off, manufacturing comes back, and this happens, and this happens. And there's just far too many variables that they don't anticipate, which creates this unintended consequences. Is there any history of governments being able to control? And it's more complicated than ever, as you were alluding to much earlier, but more complicated than ever, more variables than ever. Has anybody ever succeeded? Because they keep trying to sell that to the public.
No, it's never worked even once.
Yeah.
It's, look, this is what got me interested in analysis. When I went to physics class, they said nothing's random. You went to economics class, everything's random, so we can control it. It was like, one of you people are lying. It's just. And then I went to history class, and they showed me a movie. It's called The Toast of New York. And, it was about the Panic of 1869, and gold was $162 an ounce. I'm going, but it's $35 today. That's what got me interested in cyclical analysis. It's not a straight line, but that's what they were teaching us in school. Oh, we can smooth out the business cycle and make sure, raise interest rates, lower interest rates. Well, it doesn't work. When Keynes did that, it was the 1930s. All right. The U.S. had a balanced budget. Today, the U.S. is the biggest, borrower in the room. So the Fed didn't raise rates today. Why? Because now the Fed has realized if they raise rates, it doesn't stop inflation. Why? Because then the government expenditures go up anyhow. So the central banks have been neutered, basically. All the theories that they had from the Great Depression, none of them work anymore. But they can't say this publicly because it's a confidence game.
I'm gonna finish with one quick question that's out of this, and obviously you're when people subscribe to the private blog on Socrates and the public blog that they can get at armstrongeconomics.com, you talk about this, but I think it's worth reiterating in the context is, why does gold move? We've had a record high in gold in every currency, but led by the US dollar, of course, for quotes. But it's not got to do with inflation and some of these other things. It's got to a much more core issue.
It's basically neutral. Okay. When they put the sanctions on Russia, that's what's created the BRICS. And you have people, they were going to create a gold back. No, I mean, that's nonsense. They moved to gold in reserves. Yes. Why? Because if we went to war with China, do you think they're going to pay the debt that China holds? They'll default on it. You're not stupid.
Yeah.
You don't hold the debt of your adversary.
And
And they had 10%. So, I mean, you move to gold basically because it's neutral. You don't care if the United States wins, Russia wins, Europe wins. It doesn't matter. Gold makes the transition. So that's what its real purpose is. Inflation, I've always laughed at. Gold was 875 in 1980. The national debt was 1 trillion. It's now close to 35. So in theory, if gold went up with inflation and the debt, all these people always talk about, it should be over $30,000 an ounce. It's not. Okay. It's geopolitical. That's what is driving gold up right now. It's the concern about war. I don't care how many ceasefires they try or whatever. Russia is preparing for war. It's not stupid. It knows it. Europe you had Poland order all males to report for military training. All males. In Germany, our staff there said guys who were 60 years old were told to report. Britain is also, talking about, conscripting everybody there. Why? I mean, Russia knows what's going on. It seems to be Minsk 2.0. Oh, let's just get peace. We'll pretend we got peace and build an army while we're waiting.
Well, as I say, that's why I want to talk. We've got some, Socrates' model has a couple of very important dates coming up in May, and I want to make sure we can talk after that because they're going to have direct impact on what you've just been discussing. But in the meantime, I want to say thanks. This has been terrific. Great to talk with you, and thanks for taking the time.
Well, we got to basically just tell the truth to everybody so that they wake up and look at what's going on out there, because I've never seen the mainstream media lie so much. This is the worst, I think, of my entire life that I've ever watched now.